Mixtape with Scott. I'm the host, Scott Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics at Baylor University down here in Texas. And this week, in a previous cut of this, I had a really long thing I was saying. They got a little bit rambly. I'm going to cut to the chase. This week, we have a friend of mine, a good friend of mine that I think a lot of young people in the profession in economics know who this is. This is a professor in the University of California Berkeley Law School. Andrew Baker. Andrew wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Financial Economics with David Larker and Charles Wang. That was the winner of the Jensen Prize for the best paper published in corporate finance that year. It was called "How Much Should We Trust Staggered Difference in Differences Estimates?" And he's sort of been a person, along with Pedro Santana, Kirill Borisak, John Roth, Brant Calloway, and others, and DeChase Martin and DeHopeful and others, that's just written during this has been sort of part of this growing awareness of the problems with traditional difference and differences modeling, and kind of exploring these alternative methods or flat out inventing them. Andrew didn't invent anything, but this "How Much Should We Trust Staggered Diff and Diff" is sort of has been an influential paper, especially within finance and accounting. So, but Andrew also is someone that I kind of think of as a great person to hear their story. He was in economics as an undergraduate and actually worked for an economic consulting firm after he graduated. But he went sort of a different route. He did one of these joint JD PhDs. It was a PhD in the business school at Stanford and a JD there, where he kind of continued to drink from the economics fire hose, taking a bunch of classes from Hito Embens in particular, as well as doing a pre-doc with John Donahue, and ended up kind of sorting into this area that's finance and public policy, as well as law. And so I just wanted, to hear his story, to learn more of it. I can personally love him, genuinely love him. I'm on a Slack channel with him and Pedro and Andrew Gibbon Bacon, and it was to write a paper. And of course, I don't know what happens on productive Slack channels. I don't know if people are actually getting work done. All we do is make jokes and become better friends. And so I've come to love him a great deal. I think that a lot of you people probably do appreciate his wit and his kind of approach. So anyway, this is Andrew Baker. He's professor of law at University of California, Berkeley. And I'm going to turn it over to listening to him. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like this kind of stuff, if you could like it, share it, etc., follow it. Thanks a lot for doing that, even if you don't. See you. Well, it's my pleasure to have a person that I've been fortunate enough to become what I consider a friend of mine, Andrew Baker. Andrew, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, bud.
Well, for the sake of the listener, can you tell us where you work and what your title is and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of law at Berkeley Law School. I teach kind of business law and securities regulation.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a law professor.
Cool. All right. Well, let's get off and started. So, before we get into it, I have like a little icebreaker.
Okay.
So when you reflect on any vacation that you've ever had, whether it was a kid, whether it was older, whether it was recent, what's a vacation that you've had that you still think about every now and then? Doesn't mean it's your favorite, but it kind of like you've noticed that you've thought about it a little bit.
Good one. Well, one I just thought about the other day. So there was this video of these people in like some sound off of Vancouver, and it was like the lady woke them up at 6:30 in the morning to come see these humpback whales. And my first thought was like, I'd be pissed. Like it's 6:30, I'm trying to sleep. And it reminded me of my wife and I, when we started dating, we went on a trip to Panama, like two or three months after we had started dating, like not that long, but I like moved to California and have been working and was like, I want to go on a trip. Like, if you want to come. And so we went, we didn't really know much there, but we ended up staying on this island off of Panama for a little bit. And like we were staying at, it was like an Airbnb kind of, it was not even an Airbnb, it was almost like a little like mini hostel that these environmentalists ran.
Yeah.
And so they were like obsessed with the environment. It had like all these crazy frogs and all this stuff. It was cool. But we were coming back after like a long day, and they were like, we were like crossing them on this narrow path in our car. And they were like, Andrew, like Jasmine, you need to come. The like huge mega turtles are on the beach hatching. Like, this never happens. Like, the people go there specifically for this. And we were like, eh, yeah.
Did you go?
We're gonna go back and just like take a nap to Netflix. And they were just like, the look on their face was just like,
Is that when you knew that you and Jasmine were meant for each other and
yeah,
that neither one of you
maybe.
cared about the turtles?
Yeah. These people, I just will never forget. Guys.
What's what's that? Hold on, I lost you. Wait, I can't hear you for some reason. Hold on. Okay. Oh, okay. That's funny. Well,
Yeah.
tell me where you grew up, man. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, kind of a medium-sized town, probably very similar to the, little Mississippi shanty that you grew up in, I imagine.
Yes, I bet it was just like it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so yeah, I'm an East Coast guy originally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh. How big was that little town?
There's like 60, 65,000, so it's kind of a
Okay.
suburb of Hartford, obviously.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, I actually, didn't mind where I grew up. I was really ready to get out of there by the time it was over, and I've never gone back. My family doesn't live there anymore, so I don't
Oh.
really go back too frequently, but it was a good place to grow up. It was kind of
Hmm.
not the like Connecticut. It was not, our town was very nice, but it was not like, like Greenwich or some of the places that you kind of think of Connecticut.
Okay.
Kind of like
Okay.
in the middle. Yeah. But it was like, we had really, really good public schools. And
Mm.
so kind of feel very lucky. Went to college and was able to make fun of all my friends who went to private school because I was like, I
Mm.
went to public school, I'm better than you. But meanwhile, my parents capitalized all that cost into their mortgage. But yeah, no, it was really good public schools, and still have a lot of good friends from growing up. But yeah, now I've been on the West Coast for about like 13 years almost.
Oh. What'd your parents do for a living?
So my mom took a bunch of time off of work after the kids were born, and kind of raised us for a little bit, and then she went back and she first worked for like Chico's, like the women's clothing store. Uh,
Oh,
and she kind of sold advertising for like one of like the local newspaper, like West Hartford News. She would like
okay.
kind of, she got to know like the businesses in town and sold kind of advertising in the local paper. And my dad actually sold bridges.
Bridges.
Yeah.
How do you get into that kind of thing? He's an engineer or something?
No, he's not. He's a salesperson. So it's mostly like commuter bridges and things. So it's not like, selling like the Golden Gate Bridge or, something like that. It's mostly like highway bridges. And
Oh.
so there's a company, I actually don't know exactly how. He first worked for this company called Hilti, which you probably know, like tools and things like that.
Huh.
And then that was like when I was born, and then he moved to this bridging company. Presumably, like there's just sales, like
Never even
some.
thought about that. Huh. So
Yeah, it's a
he,
job that I don't think really exists anymore, to be honest.
yeah,
Because like his job was to pretty much like come up with bids and like bid against rival
yeah,
companies, and like I just
right,
wonder how much of that is now completely automated in terms of,
right.
you know what I mean, like the expertise you need to figure out what the winning bid will be. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
interesting to hear him talk about like, the strategy you'd have to do of like, trying to figure out who else was going to bid and what the right bid was. And I just feel like so much of
Mhm.
that now must be
Yeah,
just.
sure. Sure. I never even thought about that. Well, so what kind of games and stuff did you do when you were little? What kind of stuff were you, what kind of kid were you?
I think I was a real pain in the ass, which I think is like carried forward. I don't hide
That's
anything.
probably, yeah, I can't. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems
Yeah.
like it must have been a different kid back then.
Yeah. I feel like I relied on the fact that like I got good grades to just like get me off the hook for just being a general overall pain in the ass. And like now that I'm a parent, I kind of am like suffering the consequences of that. I feel like, the karmic balance of the universe is whipping back around. But yeah, no, like growing up, I mean, I was I always liked reading when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So, I started reading early and I was into school and I liked reading. I played sports. I was a big lacrosse player. It was kind of
Oh.
my main sport. But growing up, I also played soccer and some other stuff. I was never
Mm-hmm.
that into video games. I was really bad at them for the most
Mm-hmm.
part. Really enjoyed kind of smoking weed with my friends for a good part of my childhood. Just general suburban life stuff.
Well, what did you want to be when you were like, in middle school? What did you want to be when you grew up? You're
You know,
smart. You're good.
when I was younger, I actually really wanted to be an engineer. I think it's because like my dad worked with a lot of engineers, even though he
Yeah.
was an engineer, and I really liked math when I was younger.
Mm,
So I had like skipped a grade in math, was really into math, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. And then kind of like 9/11 happened when I was in eighth grade, and then I just got really kind of into more into politics and
mm,
just I regret it a lot. I kind of just stopped with math. At a certain point, I like skipped a grade. I took a when I was like a junior, I took like I don't know, Calc 3 or something like that, like the local college. They had like school district had to pay for me to go there.
mm.
And like but then I just kind of got over it. I hadn't realized at that point that like you would be using math for all of the stuff that, we are interested in. I kind of in my mind, it was like math was for doing engineering
Oh,
or something like that. And so yeah, I originally thought
you
I was
sort of
gonna,
were substituting into this interest that you had in politics, and you sort of put behind the mathematics, and
yeah, I just
sort of,
kind of like stopped and yeah, and so like I went to Georgetown thinking that I was gonna be really interested in doing politics.
yeah.
And after like 6 months, I was like, oh, this is actually miserable. I don't want to do politics. The idea of like
When you
canvas.
say politics, what do you mean? You thought you wanted to be a politician?
No, not necessarily be a politician. I mean, so I went to like the Foreign Service School at Georgetown and thought I'd
Yeah.
be interested in something like that. I mean, I kind of went in thinking some kind of international politics, maybe something like the Foreign Service or something related to that, like but being within the political system in some way.
Yeah.
And then I kind of got disabused of that kind of I don't know. I just saw what it was actually like and didn't really want to do
You
that.
chose you chose Georgetown because it had this Edmund School of Foreign Service. Like you were in high school and you were like, Georgetown has this thing called Edmund School of
Yeah.
Foreign Service. I want to do foreign service. That was your brain.
Well, kind of. It was actually kind of funny because actually my dream school all along was UNC. And I
Chapel Hill. You wanted to go
applied.
to Chapel Hill.
I wanted to go to Chapel Hill. I loved it. Like the campus was beautiful, the weather, people.
Hmm.
I really that's where I really wanted to go, and I got in, and I was like set on going. But I applied to this foreign service school and didn't really think about it. And then I got in, and I remember my mom was like, "Are you really not going to do that? Like, you think you want to do, this type of stuff? Like, it seems really stupid." So my mom kind of convinced me that it was the right call, and I did it. And then I immediately decided I didn't want to, and I spent most of college regretting not being in Chapel Hill.
What was it, Chapel Hill?
I just liked it, and it
Yeah.
was like a big public school. I don't know. I went to Georgetown, and it was full of like private. It took a little while to kind of. I mean, I liked being in DC and being in a city, but I feel like I probably would have just had more fun and fit in a little more at Chapel Hill, at least the first couple of years before I found like my group of friends.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, no, so UNC was like my dream school. I used to like love watching Chapel Hill basketball growing up and
Mhm.
um yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's funny to think how your life would turn out differently if you had just made different random choices when you were
Yeah.
17 years old.
Yeah, sure, sure. Well, so how do you end up at so the Edmund School, that's not where the economics department is, but there's something called an international economics degree inside that.
Yeah, so like the Foreign Service School has a bunch of degrees within it, and then, like you're essentially taking the same classes as the econ majors. It's just like you take a few different other things. So there wasn't much of like an international focus more than if you were just kind of like an econ major at Georgetown.
You didn't have to do international economics though, did you? You could have done other majors.
Yeah, so there's like internet. They just put international in the front of a bunch of different majors that exist in other places. It's like you either are international politics, international political economy,
I
international
see.
economics. Something else. I don't know. When I was at Georgetown, I actually thought I really wanted to do like development economics. So I had like a
Mm,
in development economics, and that was a lot of the classes I took that I was focused on.
hmm.
Um,
Oh, no, I lost you again.
can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay.
That's fine. tinkered with my headphone thing. Yeah, so I thought I was going to be interested in development economics, and so most of the classes I took were around that. The internships I did were about that. I interned with like the Center for Global Development, and so that was more of my focus at that point in time. And then, I actually applied for some jobs to do that right out of school, and just kind of ended up not doing it, and then just kind of life went a different way.
Hmm. What'd you like about economics in college? How quickly did you find it
Yeah, I mean, I think I even did like AP economics when
in
I was
high
in high
school?
school. Yeah, and so I kind of came in taking, I was like placed out of like introductory micro and that stuff. So I was taking economics classes from the jump.
Hmm.
What did I like about it? I mean, uh, I liked, especially at Georgetown, because I was in this kind of like international focus. So I was taking a lot of classes about international stuff, but then it allowed me to kind of use math stuff that came easier to me, in that way. And so I ended up,
But your
uh,
first love was this like policy public. How would you describe your kind of mind in high school? Your home was not necessarily in like a philosophy, but like in what, like service or something?
no, I mean, I think I was like, you know, I don't know. The way I always think about it is, I mean, I was interested in math. I was taking a lot of math classes. 9/11 happened, and I just still remember like the first formative years of my kind of, young adulthood, I guess, of being just like watching the news nonstop, like following what was going on in Iraq, following, all the protests, the developments, the Bush years, and kind of how much of my psyche and persona got wrapped up into all of that.
What's
You
that? That's college. That's when you're, how old are
This
you?
was like high school.
Oh, so
College,
9/11
I was
hits.
I was in college from '06 to 10 pretty much. So I
Oh,
was like
okay.
halfway through Obama got elected. So I was first last 2 years of the Bush administration. But like for most of my high school and like late middle school was kind of the Bush administration. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just what became, I mean, I don't know if it was, I don't think it was that way for everybody, but I also think it was that way for a lot of kids of my kind of age, my vintage,
Mm,
talk to, like of kind of, coming of age following 9/11 and the catastrophe of the Bush administration, then
mm,
going to college and having the economy collapse halfway through and the job market collapse, right? And so it's kind of interesting to think about how those things like determine, it's kind of like the, senior macroeconomists of today who just simply can't get over like hyperinflation of the 70s. And so kind of lets it color everything that they think about the world. I think
mm,
there's some aspect of that for us in our generation of thinking about the things that, will always stick with us.
mm.
Yeah, so that was, I think, kind of like the development of like how I got into things. And so then I got, I
But
don't know
then
if I,
like what are you, okay, I get that, but then like what are you drawn into for this like international? It's because you're not being drawn into this economics degree because you're like, yeah, I read about the invisible hand, or I saw a supply and demand curve, and like, or I read Becker's thing, or something. Like, what exactly is drawing you to the economics connecting it to 9/11? What exactly is going on?
no, I don't think that even the economics connected it to me. So like the way it works is if you apply, when you apply to Georgetown, you apply to one of the schools. And so I just applied to the Foreign Service School. Honestly, it wasn't even, there's a box that you checked on the application.
Oh,
At
okay.
that point, I was like, you could apply to something called the college, you could apply to the nursing school, or you could apply to the Foreign Service School. And I was like, Foreign Service School sounds cool. Like, and
Yeah,
it's kind of like a prestigious thing within Georgetown, which I knew when I visited it. And so I just checked the box. And so
got it.
once you're there, you got to pick one of these majors your second or third year. I can't remember. And so then within there, you're sitting there and it's like you either do international economics, international politics. I was always a little more on the economicsy end within my classes. So it seemed natural. My advisor was an economist, this guy, Mitch Kaneda, who I think is still there actually. And he was kind of my faculty advisor. You get paired up with one when you're at the Foreign Service School. Just seemed natural as most of the classes I was taking. But yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of I found economics classes interesting on their own, regardless of kind
Mm,
of what I wanted to use them for. And
yeah.
then you realize halfway through college the instrumental value of different degrees, right? And different classes and obviously taking economics classes carries benefits and learning skills that you can take with you. I mean, I didn't learn nearly enough when I was an undergrad. Like my coding
Mhm.
skills were minimal in comparison to, we're interviewing pre-docs and stuff right now, and it's just insane how
Yeah.
much more developed these kids are than I
Yep.
was at their stage. But still, like being able to do something and play with data and do internships where I was helping people do research, and you realize,
Mhm.
playing with data is fun. And yeah, I think that's kind of, I don't think there was a whole lot of thought with 18-year-old Andrew besides kind
Mhm.
of, just one step after another, but kind of just how I stumbled into it. Yeah.
Well, so when you're at the end of Georgetown, when you think back again to the what you wanted your life to be about, what were you thinking about at the very end when you graduated?
Yeah, man, I've been thinking about this recently. I didn't know. I really didn't know. I had had kind of a rough college experience a little bit. So my sophomore year, my best friend passed away. Like I was the one who found him. We were at a party and kind of
Mm.
unfortunate circumstances. And then like a year later, my mom passed away suddenly. So I
Mm.
kind of was just getting through college for the most part. And so that when I actually graduated a semester early because I just had enough AP credits and it felt ridiculous to make my dad spend another $30,000 just to stay. So I
Yeah.
kind of like I was just getting through, man. I went and traveled like right out like when I went and I lived with my dad for like a month or two. As he was settling into whatever his new life is. And then I went and I did this trip to Central America. I went to Costa Rica and volunteered a little bit. And then I met up with some friends from Georgetown on their spring break in Nicaragua. And then I went back to DC and was waiting tables at the restaurant I worked at and just trying to figure out what the next step was. And
Mm.
I was applying for jobs and I think people kind of knew like this kid has no idea like what he wants to do and like
Mm.
interviewing and not getting jobs. I remember I accidentally interviewed at AEI. I had no idea what it was, and I
Oh
got in
yeah.
there. Why are there pictures of Newt Gingrich everywhere? They get into this interview, and they're like, it was like I was just lying. I
You
had no idea
bombed
what I
that
was doing.
interview. It probably did.
Oh yeah, I don't think it went well. I remember too. The one was like I interviewed with the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, man, and this was the roughest interview I've ever had. It was like the guy was being like, "All right, so like assume that there's a shock to interest rates," and it goes, like literally grilling me on like the underpinnings of like macroeconomics, and I don't know, man. Supply goes up, demand goes down. I was totally. People were like studying for these interviews and prepping, and I was just kind of sleepwalking through everything at that point. Yeah.
Well, so what happens? How long are you out of school? How long between grad school and graduation from undergrad? How long is that?
Yeah, it was like probably 3 or 4 years. So yeah, pretty much I was in
Oh,
DC. I was waiting tables.
so you hung around. You stayed in DC for all this time.
No, no, no. So what happened was I was in DC. I was waiting tables. I was applying for jobs. I wasn't having very much luck. I mean, it was only a couple months. It wasn't like super, super long.
Hmm.
But I was just like, I don't know. I kind of got an itch. I was like, I just need to not be here. I was
Yeah.
kind of hanging out with all my friends from college, doing the same thing. So I just moved to California.
Oh,
Like,
you just moved
uh,
out to the Bay
yeah.
Area?
Yeah, to the Bay Area, didn't have a job. So my best friend who passed away, I met this guy that was his really good friend at his funeral actually.
Oh.
And so he came out and he lived in San Francisco at that point, and his name was Gilbert, and he was just like this amazing guy, and we had kind of all gone out to California my senior year to like go do a trip with them, just to like some of the friends that our friend had made when he was in college. And so we went out there, a few of our friends, and like I'd never been before. And we like went to this lake and hung out in San Francisco, and it was awesome. And I was just like, I want to try something different. And so I went
Yeah.
and I asked him if I could sleep on his couch for a little bit. And I was like trying to get restaurant jobs for a few weeks. And I actually finally just did like the whole point of like why you get an expensive degree, which was like found out that there was an alumni network website, and
Mm.
just sent an email to somebody who was working in economic consulting in the Bay Area and was like, I see you on the alumni network. I'm interested. I'm an undergrad, international economics major. And then I ended up landing an interview at that place. And that,
You have are you do you have at this point like quantitative background? I mean, that's like, for the sake of the listener, that's one of the things I've always, noticed is the how natural it all comes to you. So like, do you have that in college and after graduation, this skill set?
I didn't have a ton of coding experience at all. And so this job, like the econ consulting jobs are actually really kind of useful in terms of getting training, like on the job
Mm,
training, right? And so these are kind of cases where you're supporting economic experts, right? Some of these firms, like Analysis Group, they have experts who are like university professors and
yeah,
they provide some of the work for them. There are other companies where it's like the experts are kind of in-house and full-time. And so ours was one of those shops.
yeah.
I mean, I came in, I think I had good intuition, but I didn't have like I didn't know how to use Excel well, even. I didn't,
Mm,
I used data in classes, but my use of it was very, very minimal at that point. Uh,
mm.
and so I kind of learned on the job kind of how to actually do stuff. But I really liked it. I found the work super interesting. So I worked really, really hard. I was working
You
like eight.
found the work interesting and the programming interesting, or is the
Yeah,
programming
yeah, it
like
was
you
fun.
said?
Figure.
Yeah,
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 it was for both of them and the work. So this is so our shop. So now I study. We can talk about this later, but I study kind of like law and finance. At this point, I knew nothing about finance, and I
yeah.
never really taken any finance classes. I knew very little. And this was like in the wake of the financial crisis, and we were working on all of these cases about the financial crisis. So I didn't even know. I mean, I knew that banks had collapsed, but I spent a lot of time just reading books, figuring out what it was. I mean, we were working on cases about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We were working on
Yeah.
cases about AIG. I got
Mm,
to work on Madoff cases and go to Vienna, Austria, go to Austria to like, work on mapping feeder funds to Madoff funds. Like
mm.
as like a 22, 23-year-old kid, I was getting to work on really big cases and do cool stuff. And
Wow.
so like that was, and now this is the type of stuff that I study. So I always think about that I worry that we like force these kids to like know what they want to do nowadays
Yeah.
at such an early age. And people have talked about this a lot. It's part of the reason why I find things like pre-docs and all this to be actually be good, whereas
Hmm.
everybody else thinks that it's just another, just extending the time frame. And I think there's something to that if you know exactly what you want to do. But I don't know how you're supposed to know what you want to do at such a young
Totally.
age. Like
Yeah.
I would be doing something, I'd be like, studying latrines in like Tanzania right now, which like maybe that'd be a better use of my time, but like I don't think I would be happier doing that than what I am
Mm,
now. So yeah, that job was like pretty formative for me. And I had like a lot of
mm.
really mentors who kind of helped me a lot.
What'd you start to notice about yourself and your like your interests, while you're at that job? Is it that you were like it was the finance part? You started to kind of see that you actually really thought you loved the finance, or is it still the public policy elements, or what's the deal?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like love finance, qua finance, like in terms of like, figuring out how to calculate a weighted average cost of capital or something like that, right? But at that point in time, what were like some of the big policy questions that were going on in the
Yeah.
Obama, administration
Yeah.
was
Finance.
topics that we were doing. And, kind of realizing like if you care about the things that I cared about, which was kind of just general, you know, societal concerns and how we figure out how to set up a public policy that works. A lot of it was about
Mm,
finance at that point. It
mm,
was about how we think about designing structures so that this stuff doesn't happen. And so getting to kind of like work on cases about the actual collapse and spending a bunch of time just like reading books,
mm,
about the financial collapse and trying to figure out exactly, what were the kind of mechanism design flaws that led to all of this? Like, what were the regulatory failures? So, that wasn't what I was doing on a day-to-day basis, but it
yeah.
gave me the opportunity and the skills to kind of like and the know-how to like kind of understand what was going on in a way that I didn't previously.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so, I mean, I think that was, and then I ended up leaving after a few years, knowing that what I wanted to study more was stuff at the intersection of kind of public policy and financial markets, corporate
Mm.
governance, kind of some of these type of topics that now is what I study and what I'm interested in. And before that job, I would have like had very little kind of idea that it was something I would find interesting.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, I can see how that would have all kind of coalesced that historical kind of interest in politics, and then this math, and then this job where all this context is going on. So how you're only there a couple of years, and then you reach a point where you say, I want to be what, a professor, or what are you missing in your life where you feel like I need to go back to school?
Yeah, I mean, so it was an insane job. like it was fun and I'm glad I did it, but we were pretty much we were there was this former company called LECG, which was a Berkeley kind of shop actually. So it was like started by David Teese and a bunch of other Berkeley law, not Berkeley law, but Berkeley economics professors and Berkeley business professors.
Mm,
LACG went bankrupt because they hired too many people. They spun off this group, which was just the finance group of LACG. And so that's what I was
mm,
working for. And
uh-huh.
essentially, there was a standalone unit that more or less, my boss was trying to get purchased by one of the other shops. These are firms like, Cornerstone, Compass Lexicon, right? You've probably
Yeah.
seen some of these. And so we were working we had so much more work than we had people. And so I was working like really like 80-hour weeks quite
Mm,
frequently. Like, I was burnt out at the end of it. And so I was ready for something. And what actually happened, I'd started to think I was ready, but I had applied when I applied, was applying for all these jobs when I moved to San Francisco. I'd applied for like a pre-doc position at Stanford. And then they reached back out to me like 2 years later. They were like, we have your like resume on file and we're looking to hire somebody again. And at
oh,
that point, I was
interesting.
like kind of ready. Yeah, it was another one of these kind of serendipitous things that just happened. And so then I just sent my updated resume and was like, yeah, I'd be interested in this. And it was a way to kind of transition more into areas of things that I was interested in, but still kind of staying in the space of um, kind of econ work. And so, yeah, I thought it was a good opportunity to figure out what my next steps were going to be. I knew I was going to apply to some school. I wasn't sure I was going to apply to law school at that point. I was thinking more of a PhD. Um, but even then, the kind of realizing that a pre-doc was a good opportunity. It was like a lot less formalized than it is today.
Mm.
But but yeah, that's got that
So it
email.
was an econ pre-doc or what was it?
Yeah, so it was at the law school, but it was with John
Don
Donahue.
Donahue. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So he had a few pre-docs, and so he's an economist and lawyer. And so I was mostly working on stuff outside the area of what I'm kind of mostly interested in,
Mm.
but it was kind of crime research. I was working primarily on gun control research
Yeah,
that
yeah,
year.
yeah. Wait, you were
Yeah,
involved in that synthetic control study?
I was not, but I was one of the people on that paper, Michael Weber, uh, was I think that was his name. Him and I were pre-doc at the same time, so he was actually working on he came up with the idea, I think, or him, and I think Abe was on that paper too, who's now my colleague, who was a
Mm,
former pre-doc of John as well. But I
mm.
was working on kind of a response to the NRC report about kind of they had come out with a report saying, we're going to analyze John's work and John Lott's work, and we're going to come down on
That
which
was a
side.
long time ago, wasn't it?
A long time ago. The report was a long time before, and even the project that I was working on. And then we were still responding. John's been working on this stuff for decades. I don't know how he has the fortitude to continue on with these battles, but he does. And so, yeah, that's mostly what I was working on. There was a little bit of capital punishment work too, but
Mm,
primarily on gun control stuff.
yeah.
And so it was
The
a good
Joanna
opportunity.
Shepherd, Paul Rubens stuff.
The stuff that I worked on there was he was the main expert on this long running death penalty case in Connecticut,
Oh,
right? So he ended up doing some academic research from it, which was mostly just kind of formalizing
I
what
think
his
I know
report
this.
was.
Is it something about African Americans?
Yeah, so it's kind of like
They get it more
yeah, and I
traditional on the
think
crime or something?
yeah, then like it's kind of saying that the way that the death penalty is implemented is kind of arbitrary or biased,
Yeah.
both based on if the perpetrator and also who the victim is too, to kind of
Yeah,
forgive the
right. I
ways.
remember
And
this.
so
I remember the paper.
yeah, it's a common attack on the death penalty through different states. I mean, it's not like John's the first one to have done this, but it comes
Yeah.
down to statistical analysis of kind of what are the cases that could potentially be charged, who
Hmm.
gets charged, and trying to convince. And he ultimately was successful. I mean, it took him. He worked on that case for a very, very long time. I have a lot of just respect for John as it is, but also he has like an insane stamina to keep with these things for a really long time. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So then that was probably pretty important because he's PhD JD.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And
so
so I
you
didn't know before then if I wanted to do law or not. And he kind of
uh,
talking with him and being there and seeing the stuff that kind of JDs and PhDs were doing kind of convinced me to apply to law school too.
was there a time where you were thinking about the PhD in economics though?
Yeah, I actually applied the year I applied to law schools. I applied to a bunch of PhD programs too. I didn't get into any. I just, like I
Mm.
said, I stopped taking math for the most part, and
You
so I,
probably heard what happened in the at that AEI interview.
yeah, yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
forget it. This guy's trouble.
yeah. Well, there's also the Fed interview and
We
the
don't
A.
want him, man. That's
Yeah,
right.
me
You always
neither.
act like you didn't want us.
Yeah.
It's the other way. Uh,
Yeah, exactly, right. So no, I applied and then I got into law school though, so I figured
yeah.
I'd start law school.
Oh,
And
so
I
you just got into the law school. You didn't do one of these joint PhD JD
No,
things.
I did end up doing it, but
You
what I
did
did
do
is
it,
I
but
started law school and then I ended up taking I you can do like a master's in econ at Stanford. And so
oh,
I started doing that. And so I took the kind of like first year micro sequence and then reapplied and got into a PhD at the business school in my second year. And so
what's
then
it
my
called?
last
It's called business something.
so everybody who gets a PhD from the business school, you get a PhD technically in business administration,
Yes.
like different focuses, right? And so ours, my group, was the accounting group. There's finance, political
Mm,
economy, organizational behavior. Technically, on like our degrees, it all says like PhD in business administration.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was wrote this question down. Then I was going to kind of transition into your career now. So one of the things that first I'll just say this, this is something I've noticed. One of the things I've noticed about you and many people are in your general circle of influence is that you kind of do remind me of this younger group of people. You kind of mentioned that it's even you're noticing it even more, but like I've noticed it with you, who are these kinds of like fairly sophisticated, practical computer scientists, this social scientist, and this kind of I was struggling to find the word, but like pragmatic philosopher about society and rules. But it's like you had a different way of saying it. You said general well being. Is that right? Is that what you said? That's kind of your interest is like, you're not like, it's not like you were like, wow, I read von Mises or whatever. And now I'm like, got this like full apparatus in my head. You've
Yeah.
kind of got this like down homey kind of like common sense approach. Is that right? Or what do I
Maybe.
think?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying. I mean, I don't think I have extremely focused interests necessarily in the way that some other people do. Like, I think, I mean, I have certain areas of things I focus on and study. For me, I always like, I mean, I still kind of try to read a lot. I try to be like, I mean, I'm more interested in kind of, I don't know, thinking about the state of the world, the country, right? And thinking about how our different research ties in. Versus, I mean, we can talk about the, benefits and flaws of different approaches, but like the hyper specialization of a PhD these days, right? I mean, people come out with just like an insane amount of knowledge on one specific topic. Like I actually really like being at a law school because when I go to our
Mm-hmm.
seminars, they're on completely different topics, right? I mean, I remember when I was at Stanford as a law student, I would always go to the seminars because like 10 students could go and like the food was way better than what we'd get as students and like nobody ever went. And it would be like, talks about like disability law during the Civil War or something, and it's like, it's super interesting. I wouldn't know this otherwise. Like, I like to read books about things that aren't economics, right? And so I think I have a fairly like kind of like broader but not focused interest typically. But then
Yeah.
I guess I match that with like, I don't know, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to estimate stuff. So it's kind of like this yin and yang of like on the one hand, I don't know, I think my overall interests are somewhat broad, but then, I spent a lot of time in the PhD just trying to figure out, this is how we got to know each other, kind of trying
Yeah.
to figure out how to do things and realizing that like I could continue to write papers doing things wrong and ask all these different questions. But I spent just kind of like a bunch of time trying to figure out at least from an econometric perspective, like how should we think about this? The
Yeah.
area I'm in is, a lot of difference and differences. And, like I kind of got to thinking like if this stuff doesn't work here, like does it not work for all the stuff that we've done, all the stuff we think we know about this topic? And so then to some extent, a lot of my papers are kind of like hyper specialized on like specific kind of methodological critiques or contributions, which, for better or worse, maybe for worse. But but yeah, I think that's kind of like my general read, I guess, on myself as a
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, you had the fortune of like, being right in the middle of that like credibility crisis of diff and diff. And so you've got this big paper on diff and diff that's applied in your field, but and it wins an award, right? It wins like paper of the year for that journal.
It was like the corporate finance paper of the year, yeah, in the JFE. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but that's not your primary interest, right? Is that what you're sort of saying? Your primary love is not like a methods love. It's is it a methods love, or is it more of like a topic thing that you're like moving more into these specific topics now that you're interested in?
Yeah, I never would have considered myself like per se like a methods person. I think I'm much less than obviously the people we work with, either
Mm-hmm.
either Andrew or certainly Pedro, and then even people like Kirill, right, who like is not just a methods person, but like really cares a lot about kind of formally proving this stuff. I mean, my interest, and I think people think that I'm like maybe more of a methods person than I am. People ask me to give talks and stuff. Mine was really like the way that paper started was my co-author Charlie was at a conference with me, and we were talking about
Well, for the sake of the listener, will you say the name of the paper and the journal it was published in, and kind of give a little
so
background?
the
You were
paper
giving the
was
background.
we stole our title from Bertrand and Mullainathan, and it was
Yeah.
how much should you trust staggered difference and differences instead of how much should you trust difference and differences?
Yeah.
Complete lack of creativity on our side. It was published in the Journal of Financial Economics, and the way that started was there's this long literature in law and finance about staggered boards. Okay, so what these are, and not just staggered boards in particular. What we were looking at is anti-takeover statutes.
Mm.
And so what these are statutes passed by state legislatures that are intended somewhat to entrench management, to make it harder to get rid of managers. Okay.
Mm.
And so there's been a long literature not starting completely, but like really starting in earnest with a paper by Bertrand and Mullainathan, another paper by them,
Oh,
the Quiet Life Hypothesis, published in the JPE, saying that, what happens when managers face less career pressure? And the argument is that they kind of are more, susceptible to a quiet life, which is, which I think is a totally plausible story, which is like if you don't have someone breathing down your neck, you'll tend to be a little bit lazier, right? And so they find that like there's less productivity that goes on at firms, but they kind of like fire people less and close plants less, right?
yeah.
And then finance people use these, as you know, when there's some law that you can code that's already coded for you, you can
Yep.
use it as a shock for a million different things.
Right.
The problem is the law people came in shortly afterwards and said this makes no sense, like just kind of
Mhm.
institutionally, because all these laws are passed, but at the same time that these are passed, something called the poison pill is held to be legal by the Delaware Supreme Court. Okay, and what the poison pill does is essentially make all the rest of these statutes moot. Okay, so like they add very little on top of the poison pill is just way more powerful at doing what these statutes do.
Mhm.
And so they came in and said, this is another example of economists and finance people coming into a legal question, not understanding the law, and then just running with it, right?
Right.
And so there was a paper written by some law professors who both have PhDs saying, look, I was a student editor, it was a law review article saying, that it doesn't appear as though these things matter. And we look at a couple papers and look, the results aren't really there, they're spurious. And then there was another paper published in Finance by Jonathan Karpoff and Michael Wittry saying, yeah, there's something to that critique, but there still is something there, even if we adjust for the things that the lawyers are pointing out. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Um, and so that came out, and Charlie Wang, my co-author, was like, still unclear why, why if the lawyers are right, this shouldn't matter, and the finance people are still saying that there's something there. And so the
Hmm.
question, this was probably just from Twitter. I had seen all this stuff. I was like, well, maybe it's the fact they're all difference in difference papers, and maybe it's a difference in difference issue. So we started that project thinking we were going to write just about that topic, like to bring in this question, could we help resolve this debate by just the
Hmm.
fact that maybe the difference in differences are messed up, right? A
Yeah.
lot of these papers didn't even do event studies, right? So they're just looking pre-post. It could be explained by a bajillion things.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, that's how it started. But then we realized, like, kind of digging into figuring out how this worked, which was fun, right? I started off by just like writing a blog post trying to figure it out. And then, like, a bajillion
That's how
people.
it started. I
Yeah,
remember you used to do all those all the time, or you did them a
yeah,
fair
I
amount.
just like wrote a blog post about it and got like, I don't know, like just people were just that this was before Pedro and everybody had written explainers, and there was just a
Baker.do.
Baker.do. It's just a massive demand for like figuring out, and I just wrote this little simulation study and like trying to figure out how this worked.
Yeah,
Because I don't really prefer to do the algebra like Bacon. I prefer to just kind of simulate data on my computer and have it tell me what happens.
yeah,
But yeah, anyways, we started writing that paper and pretty much realized that like it was too many bridges being crossed by both kind of methodologically showing how it happens and then doing this anti-takeover specific application that had like so many moving parts to it.
mhm,
So then we just decided let's find some other papers that are in finance that are that use difference and difference and just try to show that does this matter? Because sometimes we find these things we know there's a problem, you're clustering at the wrong level, but like, does it
yeah,
necessarily really make a difference? It
yeah.
makes a difference if you think that like the 10% or 5% significance threshold really matters, given that like it's arbitrary. A lot of, and I'm not trying to critique it, but a lot of times it's like, well, the significance went from 94 to 89. And it's like, okay, well, I don't know. It doesn't change my priors that much
Mhm,
versus is this substantively important? And I think
yeah,
this is a debate you're seeing in a lot of other fields now. I mean, I think a lot of other fields are finding that it doesn't seem to matter.
yeah.
The new kind of difference in differences, for at least for us, all the papers we looked at, it seemed to make a big difference.
What does that mean to make a big difference?
I think that's the key point here too. So one of the papers we looked at, it makes a massive difference by any way you look at it. Like the signs flip, right? Like it's well, I mean, not necessarily sign because it's a null effect, but like if you look at the event study before kind of adjusting for these things, and part of the thing is, right, there's so many things with the difference. Like if you're doing like the binning of the endpoints,
Yeah,
like it was fun to learn all this as it's going. Makes a massive difference above and beyond doing Pedro's fix, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just even if you just fully saturate the event study, like in some circumstances, especially when everyone gets treated, it's going to make a huge effect,
Yeah.
right? And so part of it is, there's a good paper coming out in political science about this, saying that it doesn't seem to matter that much. But it doesn't matter much when you look at just the sign of the static two-way fixed effect. But like if it messes up the trends entirely,
Yeah.
like
Then it
then I
introduces the
don't.
idea of the selection bias might be there.
Yeah, or just like what is like the way I think about it is like the Roth and Rambishan,
Yeah.
like extrapolating out the pre-trends. If the pre-trends are now completely different, then like what we think that treatment effect is going to be completely different, right?
Hmm.
If that line changes, even if it's still post minus pre is positive or negative,
Hmm.
I don't know. So we ended up like with that paper, we found that it did for a few papers that were pretty influential in finance in different areas. It seemed to matter. Um,
So
and we
what
just
happens? You start growing the number. You guys set out to do something modest, and then what happens? It starts to kind of feel like you've got to do something even more expansive. A lot more papers get brought in, or something.
No, it was more just like what we wanted to find was papers where we could turn the fewest dials as possible, right?
Oh,
I find when you're doing this type of paper where you're trying to show that something matters, you don't want to have to change three things because then
yeah.
everybody says, well, which one of these
Which
three
one of
can
these
we go
things?
on? Right. So what we wanted to find was papers where they were good papers,
Yeah.
right? They were published in good journals. Like there was reason to believe that they're well done. And they were well done, like as of like the standards at the time for all the papers we looked at.
Hmm.
But where this issue popped up and we could show cleanly, step by step, like what happens if I do an event study. What happens if you do an event study and you don't bin, but you saturate? And then what happens if you finally do kind of like the approach that avoids the negative weighting, right? We wanted to be able to walk people through it.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
takeover context, there's a lot of other things that aren't important now. So that's kind of I've spun off as a separate paper.
Hmm.
That I think you need to take into consideration a lot of these other aspects of it. And it just
Yeah.
for the kind of pedagogical value of explaining the
Mhm.
at that point in time when people still didn't really realize what the new methods were, we wanted something where we had examples that were just kind of clean and easy to make one modification to.
Yeah. 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 Well, so like, I mean, I know it wins an award and it gets published in such a great journal, but like, how have you noticed its influence within your community, within your scholarly community?
Yeah, I don't, look, um,
I know it's got like surging sites and stuff, but like, do you feel like people are like, man, we got to take this pretty seriously, even outside of this topic?
I don't know, I mean, I think it's unclear to me. I mean, so our paper, we ended up doing mostly about finance papers. I'm not a finance professor. And so, the paper did win an award. It has a lot of cites. Presumably, I think in finance, just like in all of the econ fields now, like if you're doing a difference in difference, you probably have to do one or other of the methods,
Yeah.
right? How much has it changed the practice? I'm not totally positive.
Mhm.
It's certainly made a big difference in my life.
Yeah.
And to the point that I'm a little sheepish about it because I like the paper. Don't get me wrong. Like I spent a bunch of time doing it, but
Mhm.
I think it was a useful contribution. But like people know me as like a staggered difference to difference guy, and it's like that's not. I'm not Pedro. I don't. You know what I mean? I didn't spend a bunch of time econometrically decomposing this. I kind of was just interested in and did something I thought would be helpful. Um, and so, I think that that was maybe the best paper published in corporate finance that year. I don't know, probably not, but like I don't know, but they voted it. So it's like, we can talk about it, but people send me stuff where EJMR people are crapping on me and like, oh, he's just a stupid replication paper. And it's like, I think you're right. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I
Yeah.
didn't give myself the award. So like, I think
Well,
what
you
we
were
did.
part of that wave. You've been an important part, not to belabor this, but you've been an important part of that growing wave of kind of being aware of that. Well, I mean, you mentioned this paper that's coming out where they're like, this stuff's not a big deal. And you're like, well, it's a pretty big deal in this area. And it's a pretty big deal under these specific conditions that kind of we do know, we kind of knew it's like this when everybody gets treated, it's going to be a really big deal and stuff like that. And that's a lot of the papers.
Yeah, look, I think that the value that I bring to this stuff is just like being able to like communicate fairly
Yeah.
well. You know what I mean? I think if you talk about it, and I think that now the econometrics field puts a lot more weight on this than they
Uh,
used to. I mean, you see Pedro spending all this time doing
yeah.
this, teaching classes, focusing on it. I don't think historically that was the case at all, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think first off, like writing code didn't get you any benefit writing like a super obtuse papers that people can't read. I mean, the point of me writing that like blog post the first time was to be like, all right, we've got four different papers. Like, what's going on here? I spent time trying to figure it out, and I was like, I might as well write it down because they
Yeah.
all use different notation. They're using different theorems. It's hard to figure out like what is actually different between this one and this one. What are they saying?
Yeah.
I think my training as like kind of more of a generalist and somebody who teaches at a law school, but can kind of read these papers and spends time thinking about it, that I can kind of take it and write it for the common man, which I consider myself, right? Versus the kind of thinking man of, the super smart econometricians. I think that that was like the sole value of where I came in and
Mhm.
why I was able to like, you know, bring any value at all was just kind of trying to explain it and show it through graphs and plots in ways that I think made it clear to people like, oh, this isn't really that complicated. It's just
Yeah.
you're making bad comparisons. And if you're not careful, you're going to make bad comparisons. You're going
Yeah.
to make more bad comparisons if everyone's treated than if not everyone's treated. It's
Yeah.
not that hard of a concept, but it's sometimes hard for people who, again, like have PhDs in very focal, like, focus fields, and then they have to try to explain it to somebody who doesn't, like that's part of the downside of like the specialization, I think, of our fields.
I mean, it's kind of funny now that I hadn't really thought about because I know your story, but like that thing I was saying, which is you sort of have this smart common sense. There's a kind of common sense approach that's very dismissive. That's like I don't want to have to learn anything, and I'm just like none, and you're just dismissive. But you've
Yeah.
kind of got this like intelligent common sense and a level of confidence that you know, and you sort of then put in the work to kind of really dig pretty deep into it. Seems like it's weirdly enough kind of came together in that paper, and even kind, just like a kind of a. I mean, it's funny. I actually kind of think I didn't really think about this, but one of the things that's always impressed me is you're just kind of like, well, I don't really care what the answer is. I just want to get it right.
I mean, look, I think for us, I mean, the first time that I ever really got nailed on EJMR, I was drunk tweeting, which, like as can happen, sometimes it's not always the greatest mix. But I like bitched about how people just don't want to get the right answer on the stuff. Like, I feel like for us is like reduced, and people were like, "Who the hell does he think he is saying this?" And it was totally fair. I conceded it. I was like, it was a bad tweet, but like for us as like reduced form people, like if you don't want to get the fucking answer, then like why are we doing what we're doing? Like now, don't get me wrong, it's not like I don't have normative priors more than most people on things and choose what to study. But like if you're gonna bring data to it, like if you know something could be getting the wrong answer, like wouldn't you want to fix it? Like I don't know. I feel like
Well, it
for us,
doesn't seem like your identity is all wrapped up in it. That's the thing I was trying to say is like, because you don't seem to have this like, well, I'm a blankist or whatever, you like, you're kind of, you don't, your identity is not really wrapped up in like that's, I can't even remember how that management question. You're like, look, I mean, whatever it is, it is. And so you don't seem to have as much at stake
yeah, I mean,
in it.
I don't want to oversell that. I mean, I think I do have strong claims on the things that I care about, but I think that they're not data. Like, I actually view a
Right.
very big distinction between, because like I'm in the law, right? So a lot of the work that lawyers, like legal academics do is purely normative stuff, right? About like,
Uh,
I think this is what the law should be. I think, I'll give you claims about what I think corporate law should be about. What do I think the duties of managers to society vis-a-vis shareholders should be? I have very strong thoughts on that that aren't hidden. But those
mm,
are like, right, like anybody else in my field can adjudicate that dispute with me by based on like just our common knowledge of the law, the situation, versus once you start bringing data to the question, right? Like, and I think this is a big area where empirical stuff has come into the law. Then you're kind of talking over the heads of your colleagues who don't do data stuff. They're like, oh, well, I have to defer to, this. And at that point, if you're not getting it right, I just find it to be like just super disingenuous, right?
yeah.
It's like you can have questions about policy and about what's right and what's wrong based on social norms, where we can all like it's easy for everyone, like the cards are on the table. I think once you start bringing like the empirical veneer on it, you then give it this gloss of like this is just objective, right? This is just the objective facts of what the data show. As we know, that's like usually not true. And then at least needs to be that you're trying to get it right. And so I get frustrated when it's like, I don't want to learn new stuff. And it's like, well, if you don't learn new stuff, then you're getting the question wrong, right? Like, and I just feel like for us as applied people, there's a little bit of this, like the world's gotten so easy for us lately. You know what I mean? Where it's like we expect all the econometricians to write down packages that cleanly estimate everything for us. And we get mad if we don't read the help file that explains what's happening. And and it's kind of like I feel like as empirical people, it's on you to understand what your estimator is doing. And
Totally.
so, whatever, like people think it's a high horse. It's just like and part of it, it's a downfall for me. Sometimes I don't get as much stuff done because I spend way too much time like thinking about what the newest, you know,
Yeah.
Chernizukoff or Imbens paper because they come out every 14 days. And so, it's like there needs to be a balance between like you got to take a stand and do the best you can do, but you also have to do the work to figure out and not just rely on like I typed in DID in the computer and like this is what it tells me. Like you should understand what your estimator is doing because otherwise, like we're not adding much value.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Hey, this new paper, the one I've been bugging you about because you like told me about it. Is it okay if you sort of share a little bit about that? Is it too premature?
No, yeah, we can talk about it. We're hoping to have a draft ready soon. So yeah, this is kind of one of these areas of like of papers that I do, which is just kind of looking at the way that we do stuff in the law,
Yeah.
especially the things that are passed to courts when there's kind of some kind of statistical evidence that gets used, and trying to think, the way I usually frame it to people is like, if I were passing this idea to my econometrics professor, what
Yeah.
would he say is like the
Way to
way
do it.
think about this problem, right? Not as like the perfect way, but just like, if I didn't tell him any of the details, but I was thinking about all the training that I got, like
Right.
how would you ask a question like this? And
Yeah.
it turns out that like a lot of the ways that we're doing in court, because there's this kind of path dependency and things that have been happening for 15, 20 years have become super ossified and they don't really make a ton of sense, right? And so
Mhm.
in this case, there's a lot of litigation around the valuation of public firms. Okay, so you can imagine like the Elon Musk and Twitter example as kind of the first case where I was starting to play around with this data. People wanted to know what was going to be the walk away price of Twitter if Elon Musk backed out of the deal when he was
Yeah.
trying to get out of the Twitter deal, right?
Mhm.
Because why did people want to know that at that point in time? Because they wanted to know what the implied market probability was that the deal was going to go through.
Mm.
Right. Because everybody said, oh, like the deal price is for 50 or what did he for 40-20, right? Or like 420, 42,
Yeah.
whatever it was,
Right.
something weed. So that was the price, but the stock was trading below that. So
Right.
everybody was saying, well, that means the market is expecting that this deal is not going to go through because otherwise it would get arbitraged away.
Yeah.
And what you need to know to say that is, well, what would be the walkaway price? if what is Twitter's kind of standalone value if there's no deal? And it turns out after Elon Musk had made his offer, the stock market had collapsed for tech companies. It was like around COVID and stuff. So, and supply chain issues and whatever else was going on in the market. So it's actually just kind of like, this is just a kind of data science prediction problem. The way I
Mm,
view it, right, is like, all right, well, we know their peer firms all collapse in value. Let's just do something like a synthetic control to say, before all of this happened, before the market collapsed, can we model Twitter's stock price as some function of kind of what's going on generally in the market and a
mm,
bunch of these other tech peers? Assume that that relationship would be somewhat stable had all of this not happened, and then extrapolate out the value of the price given what happened to the peer firms, and then look at that as the standalone price and try to back out some takeover probabilities, which
mm,
I thought was an interesting exercise. And then it kind of made me think, in these cases that get brought to court all the time, we do something that's like very, very similar to kind of almost a KNN algorithm is what we're arguing in the paper. So
mm,
you say, all right, we want to know the value of this firm. Something happened to the firm that makes us not believe the market price. And we want to know what the value would have been had that not happened. Let's look for like the closest five peer firms. We decide what are the closest firms based on completely arbitrary ways that allow all this discretion from experts. Judges get
mm.
frustrated because both sides pick different comparable
Is
peer
that where the
firms.
bias enters in mainly? Is picking
Yeah,
picking the comparison group?
picking the comparison group, right? And now you could all there's also some like discounted cash flow methods where you're kind of projecting out cash flows into the future, but there you still end up needing to use a comparable analysis for the right discount rate. You look at the discount rate of the peers, right? And so yeah, you're picking out what are the comparable firms. And so the idea was, well, why don't we just pick the firms based on how well they co-move before this happened? It's just a more, at
Mm,
least I can explain what that is. There's an objective criterion that you can give to judges, which is prediction error. All right. Is it the perfect answer? No, but is it much better and much more like kind of subject to judicial oversight than is what we do now, which is, well, he says that Burger King is not really a good peer for McDonald's because they also have a big chicken sandwich business. It's just like kind of like, why does any of this matter when all we're trying to do is value the firm? Like
right.
finding the perfect peer doesn't matter, right? And so in this paper, we kind of use more or less the Imbens-Duchenko version
I
of
was just about
synthetic
to say that.
control.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like firms are on far different scale. Don't want to like have the convex hull requirement of like making sure and normalizing in the right way. So I like the like just throw elastic net on the return series and get the peers and use that. And then we do a bunch of simulation analyses and we show that it does way better and has less variance and should
Mm.
give you better estimates that each little minor change in that will be much smaller will lead to much smaller changes than changes with matching to peers based on kind of arbitrary characteristics.
But you're doing some kind of synthetic control, so you are kind of projecting a counterfactual, but it's based off the dynamics in the before period.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Projecting
exactly.
that
Yeah, it's using the
counterfactual.
time series instead of just using the one point in time to take.
Oh, I get it. They were just doing point in time that might be something, and they're like picking the
Yeah.
comparison group. They're not even doing diff and diffs or whatever. It's just like,
No, exactly. It's like a KNN
oh,
algorithm, right? And then also because firms are of much different size, you need
yeah.
to scale the values by something like accounting earnings. So you look
Mm,
at something like a price to earnings ratio. So you get kind of measurement error both in that you have to map to the ratio and then you have to back it out from the ratio. We say just use the value, use a model that allows an intercept to allow for scale differences, and we do
mm,
way better, right? And so we're trying
yeah.
to bring in a little more stuff on some actual case examples, but I think we're pretty close to having a draft ready, and hopefully, I mean, the big thing is can we explain this to judges and juries?
I was
Uh,
just about to say that. I mean, part of the thing about this K nearest neighbors
yeah,
is that like matching is so easy to explain to a normal person. I mean,
yeah,
people do. It's not. You're saying it's not even really matching though, but it's like saying, here's a bunch of things that are normal. What are you when you think about the divide of like doing better and better work, and you sort of mentioned a minute ago, like having to read pretty deep and technical work. Do you feel like you start moving further and further away from the audience, where
yeah.
trying to explain this kind of thing is going to be is its own art form?
Yeah, I mean, it is totally like I actually just presented this paper to like our full faculty at the law school yesterday, and so I had to
Yeah,
spend a lot of time on like pretty figures and explaining. But I think it's good, right? I mean, I think
yeah,
the point is to try, at least for us, the work I'm doing is trying to be policy relevant in the litigation space.
yeah,
You need to be able to explain it to judge and jury, right? And
yeah,
so I think that's the risk because I said, look, if you were to do this, if I presented this to some data science people, I'm sure they could come up with some deep learning algorithm that could beat this by a little bit. Probably not a
yeah,
ton, given the way financial markets work,
yeah.
but a little
Mhm.
bit. But then you have this black box algorithm that has all these downsides. What's nice is you have this constraint within the law world that I have like this shadow price of like making something more and more complex is going to really start to bind. And so you're trying to trade off these things of coming up with like the best answer you can, but with something that you can defend and explain. And now I think we're getting up on the edge of that being difficult in this paper, but I
Mhm.
think it's a little oversold. Everybody thinks that it's going to be too complicated, but like we already have models where we're running regression estimates in the securities litigation space where we do something very similar. And two people will argue about why their model's better because of the adjusted R squared. And like, do I think the judges and juries understand the asymptotics of like the beta coefficients between two competing models? No. And I actually think reframing this as a prediction error thing
Mm.
is our way of trying to say which of these two competing models does a better job predicting the price series beforehand. If you
Yeah.
frame it like that, I think you can actually really explain that
Mm.
to like a smart and thoughtful judge who is trying hard to get the right answer. If they
Mhm.
can do that, then I don't, if they can look at regressions, I don't see why they can't kind of look at this as a prediction error problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You look at lasso or penalized regression, it's the same thing as a regression. It just adds a penalty term on it. It
Yeah.
can't be that much more complicated, right?
Right.
And what it does, it ends up picking up just kind of like a lower dimensional set of factors typically. And so these things just end up being a lot more stable than,
But
you know,
Andrew, when you think back of the diff and diff stuff and the two-way fixed effects, even amongst PhD economists, there was like a folklore almost understanding of OLS, of what it was doing. And the new methods are kind of interesting because even something like Callaway and Santana, which is just like, just go back and do regular diff and diffs and just, weight them and, find the right control group. It's been sort of something that's kind of wild to watch people sort of prefer what, you could argue that two-way fixed effects is way more complicated.
yeah.
It's
No, it
much
is.
more deeper and very black box. And so I was just thinking like juries and judges might not be so different, that
Yeah.
like they actually might like the thing that is way more complicated and not realize that it's more complicated and they don't know how
It's
much more
true. I mean,
complicated
yeah,
it is.
it's a good metaphor or analogy, I guess. I think there's something to that, right? Because like you said, I mean, when I try to explain this to people, what's interesting is I just taught diff and diff and IB and this stuff to law students for this seminar series that we're running. And it's actually like when you actually go and explain diff and diff from the studs to these people, you're like, it's just these difference of two means. And like it would be way easier to explain Pedro's paper from that if you
Yep.
weren't like starting from a world of getting in stata and running y equals, x1 plus x2 plus g. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
that is the problem is that we kind of put the cart before the horse in a
Yep.
lot of ways. And so like actually, like you said, I totally agree that Pedro's method it is the answer to what is a difference of other types. Now, the other approaches, and I'm not trying to like disparage them, like they are potentially better because they like minimize variance using OLS. But like you said, that's actually a more complicated story. Like you
Mhm.
should like, if you just care about calculating means, you should do that.
Yeah.
But and what I find hard now is like I actually have had to code Pedro's entire thing up by hand.
Mhm.
It is a pain because you care only if you care about inference, because like the influence
Yeah.
functions
You
are
got
hard.
to learn what an influence function was, though.
I had
You
to learn
probably
about
didn't know what
influence.
that was before.
Yeah, I had to do it
Or
because
you were good in math. You probably knew.
no, I have no idea. It makes sense what you want once you like they tell you what it is. Like it's like the one observation contribution to whatever the overall estimate is. But yeah, no, like that part's hard. But if you were to just care about just the coefficients in the plots,
Yeah. Mhm.
It's literally like,
Oh,
grouping
it's
things, taking means, subtracting them. It's not that complicated.
yep.
Versus like, yeah, like actually going through and understanding what the imputation is. Like you can get what that is if you really know regressions and you use it a lot. If you were to explain that to my law students who've never run regressions, they would be way more confused by that, right? They would be,
Yes.
wait, how does this map to what you
Mm,
told me? Why is it that I care about two different levels of fixed effects? Like I try
mhm.
to explain, like we do regression difference and difference solely because it's easier and it gives us standard errors, but it's not actually easier intuitively in any
Yeah, yeah,
way.
yeah, totally,
So
totally.
yeah, I don't know, like that pedagogic, I feel like you end up in all of our conversations, you're really interested in this stuff. I kind of gloss over it eventually. I mean, I think there are interesting ideas in terms of like how pedagogical changes influence the way we think about how to do things and what's important. But I think about it for 2 minutes and then I
Yeah,
run
then
out.
you right. Well,
Yeah.
this season on the podcast, I'm doing like more of the students of person.
Yeah.
And it's like Card, Angerson, Embeds. But in a way, like I could say you're part of the series because Hito was kind of your one of your parents, your like advisor, right? He wasn't
Yeah.
you didn't wasn't your chair, but he was you learned a lot from him and he was on your committee. Is that right?
He was not, no, he wasn't on my committee.
Oh, he wasn't on the committee?
No, no, no. But I took like 4 classes with him. He's actually coming and talking to my law students on Monday. Hito is a great guy. Yeah, I knew nothing about any of these kind of like modern statistical learning things that I tend to just be using now in all my papers because I find them to be more intuitive for the problem that I have at hand, right? And that was all because I just pretty much had him 4 different times for
Yeah,
for
yeah.
classes, and that's what he was working on. So yeah, I mean, am I an embed student? I don't think he'd want to take me necessarily on his team. I think you should talk to Dimitri or some of his full-time students. But yeah, I would love to be, I mean, he's someone who I would say was extremely formative in the way that I think about attacking problems more so than um, anybody else, I would say. So, in terms of introducing me to other ways of thinking about things, instead of just kind of running through and starting with,
Mm,
and ending with some, you know, linear regression equation, which again, I don't think there's something wrong with that, but I think his kind of the way he did his classes, I thought was really effective in explaining to us kind of how the different approaches map to each other when you want to use
mm,
one. And, I still go back to my homework exercises sometimes in terms of how to figure out stuff because he had to code all this stuff up. So,
yeah.
um, yeah. And he's also, we've talked about this. I mean, just genuinely one of the nice
He's so
people.
nice. I know. He's just ridiculously nice. Well, let me end this. Okay, so there's a kid out there who's just like you. They're not like figured out their life when they're a senior in high school and have like made every decision after that that's like correct. They're like have graduated college or they're kind of in between, and you have this opportunity. Maybe it's even you're like meeting yourself and it's what do you think now that you look back, what do you think that you'd like to kind of share to somebody like that was like you about what to think about, the stuff that's coming or the stuff that, when that person's kind of down and frustrated and watching all these other people, what feels like they're lapping them. What do you want to say to that person that's like, thinks they're getting lapped?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly, because like I would like to, you learn from your life, but recognizing the stochastic nature of it all. Like I am just going to be honest, to feel so insanely fortunate to be where I'm at. Like I don't think that my life was guaranteed to go in this way by any stretch of the imagination. Doesn't mean that I didn't work hard, but
Yeah.
if being honest, like a lot of things fell my way. I mean, one thing is you get this advice a lot from people, but it's totally true, is like find good mentors helped
Mhm.
me a ton. If I think about all the times that people helped me get to where I'm at, you know, they're just amazingly lucky, but also people don't help you unless you ask them,
Yeah.
right? And so reach out, try to find people, ask for help. Is a big one, but I mean, I do worry. I don't tell people to follow my path because the world's changed a lot since then. I do. We talked about this earlier. I do worry that like you can't be 23 and not have known what you wanted to do anymore necessarily. Now
Yeah.
everyone getting into top PhD programs has done 2 years of pre-docs and has a published paper and all this, and like look, that's just the way the world is going to work when you have a limited number of slots that are getting competed on by people. Like, there's no point in like wish casting in that way.
Yeah.
But it does have real costs in the sense that we are, one, expecting kids to know at a really young age what it is they want to do, and two, we're almost certainly missing out on like people coming up who could be, very successful.
Yeah.
In particular, people who would bring different, I think, perspectives and vantage points versus people who have known and have tunnel vision what they want to do for so long. And I'm not saying tunnel vision in a pejorative sense, like you should reward people for being driven and having a goal. But if they all end up just kind of reading the same papers and thinking the same way, what's that going to mean in 20, 30 years? I don't know. So I don't have a great answer besides, try to reach out and get help from other people and rely on other people's advice and don't hesitate to kind of ask people for help.
Yeah. Well, this is the story. The podcast is kind of funny, but it's like the stories of living economists, personal stories of living economists. And in a way, I think that diff and diff paper has kind of made you in our tribe. And I know that probably hurts a little bit to think that, you've kind of got this brand on you now that
Yeah.
you're kind of this like honorary doctorate in economics. But it seems like you kind of, some of us kind of want to claim you as, as one of the good ones.
Yeah, we talk about this. I know what you're trying to goad me into. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I get great joy in finding spots to picking my spots in crapping on economics. At the end of the day, obviously, look, I like gained a ton from economics as a field. I do essentially applied economics
Right.
as a topic, as what I do. But I do think that the field has some very big blind spots that they're oblivious to
You know
sometimes.
what? Andrew? I bet you could the next paper you need to write is take an elastic net and then see if you can't figure out a more accurate measure of the statistical value of life. That's what might be missing.
That's all that's missing, right? It's just a better way to look at
I see.
the plumber.
Now I know how your brain works. That's
So
the next.
just look at the plumbers in Nashville versus Waco, and then just kind of impute the fact that you're just a less valuable human than we are in the other civilized parts of the world. So
Oh
sorry
man.
about that, guys. It's just economics. Can't fight science. That's what I'm going to be. So.
All right, man. Well, it's so
Right.
good to see you. It's
You
always
too,
so much fun to talk to you.
buddy. You
Thanks
too,
so much
buddy.
for being on it.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.